Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for giving up the Saturday afternoon sunshine to come and listen to us for won't quite be an hour. We want to be out on time, so 55 minutes or so. I'm Richard Sambrook. I'm a professor of journalism at Cardiff University in the UK, and I also work with the Reuters Institute at Oxford University. This panel is about collaboration, handling big data and investigative journalism. Springs from a workshop that we had at Oxford just before Christmas discussing these issues. Why are we seeing more collaborations between news organisations on investigative journalism? Why are we seeing more big pan-national, international collaborations and investigative stories, particularly relating to big data? What are the factors that make those big collaborations work? What are the criteria and the things you need in place in order to make those very big and complicated editorial operations work, and what are some of the problems and some of the reasons that sometimes they fail, and trying to understand a little bit what lies behind what seems to be something that has a new energy behind it in terms of collaboration around big investigations. So we have a fantastic panel here. On my right we have Anna Babinetz from the Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, OCCRP, a lot of experience in doing these kinds of investigations. Mark Abra here on my left from the ICIJ, of course did a lot of work on the Panama Papers. We have Nicholas Kayser-Bril there from J++. There's also a lot of experience in these kind of collaborations and investigative journalism. And at the end, Stuart Miller from the UK editor of BuzzFeed and formerly head of news at The Guardian. So I'm going to ask each of the panel just to say a few opening comments on their views about why we're seeing more collaborations, what makes them work, what doesn't, what are some of the key factors behind it. Then we'll get into a discussion and open it up for questions. And as I said, we're going to run for about 55 minutes, so we'll be out on time. So, Stuart, could you kick us off?
Thanks, Richard. So it won't surprise you to learn that, on this panel, people really believe in these international collaborations, and I'm not going to rock the boat there. I think there's a growing need for cooperation in journalism across borders. The reasons are obvious. There's legal threats. In the UK, the legal climate is becoming slightly more fraught. In the US, who knows what's going to happen there, and across other jurisdictions as well. So having sharing across borders for journalists helps protect us from that. Also, the targets of the sorts of stories that we go after tend to be transnational. So there's big corporations, big political movements, big money, which doesn't respect borders, and therefore neither should we. And then there's the sort of, there's resource reasons as well for these investigations. A lot of newsrooms are shrinking, and to handle some of these stories takes quite a lot of resources and expertise. And some newsrooms just aren't set up to have the sort of data firepower that Mar brings from ICIJ, for example, to be able to build searchable databases at that sort of scale. Doesn't exist in a lot of newsrooms, so you need that international expertise. And I think there's the big thing about if you have a story that goes live across multiple countries and jurisdictions, you have a huge audience and therefore a huge impact, and that's what drives real change and accountability, because it's a lot harder for ICIJ or for offshore companies to just duck away from an individual story if everywhere they look that story is running in multiple outlets. So I think the sort of reasons for these investigations is really clear. What really matters is how you do them. We've been thinking about what sort of, I've done a lot of these sorts of things, and I've been thinking about the different kinds of collaboration there are, and it struck us that they are like having real relationships, and they fall into the sort of similar categories of having real relationships. There's the one night stand where you will collaborate on one story. It's it's quick, it's straightforward, everybody leaves happy, and we're all friends afterwards. There's the holiday romance, which is something that might go on for a couple of weeks and leaves you with a rosy glow and a bit of nostalgia, but again, it's all quite straightforward. There's the kind of, the big scale ones that Mar will be involved in. I like to think about as a sort of deep and open relationship with a revolving cast of partners, which are incredibly successful. And then there's, the ones that I've been involved in with the New York Times or ProPublica, especially where you're countering legal threats, where it's a sort of marriage of convenience. It's a bit like Green Card with Gerard Depardieu, if you're old enough to remember that. But, you know, where you come together because you've got material and there's legal threats, and it works, and then that sort of grows into a sort of lasting relationship, as we did with The Guardian and the New York Times on WikiLeaks and Snowden. So there's lots of different kinds, and you have to know what sort of kind you're getting into before you start. A couple of other thoughts. I think it's really important when you're doing these things to establish the ground rules up front, because it's never the thing that you think is going to screw it up that can screw it up. So very rarely is the argument about the story or where the story should go, but often it's about what time the story should launch and who gets to press the button first and whose byline goes first. And you have to, if you agree those things first up front, you'll avoid a lot of trouble further down the line. You have to come with a lot of good faith, and you've got to realize that you're not going to win every argument. You've got to have a willingness to compromise and realize that the story overall is more important than you know, holding true to every tenet of your 200-year-old journalistic culture. I think each party has to bring something to the table. These collaborations are not just, you know, we want your audience and we've got some documents. It has to bring reporting or technical expertise or presentation capability or legal maneuvering. That's really important. And another fundamental ground rule, I think, and probably the most important one, is that once you are sharing sensitive material, the original source becomes everybody's source. And it's really important that the duty of care to that source extends across all the organisations. And this was especially true when you're doing stories like Snowden or WikiLeaks, where the original source is taking massive risks to get this material out, and they're doing it on the basis that you will respect a set of rules that they've laid down. And if you have partners, they have to respect those rules too. A couple of final thoughts. Challenges are huge. They are horrifically expensive to do these investigations, even when you're sharing material. The technological challenges are huge. Just being able to share them securely is really tough, and ICIJ are sort of fantastic at making secure databases available wherever you are in the world, which is sort of game-changing in my experience. Then there's the legal threat, as I say. In the UK, that's becoming more and more scary, the US obviously as well, and we are going to have to be sort of really nimble and clever as to how we collaborate to get around these threats.
Stuart, thanks very much. Mark, can I come to you next? Because obviously ICIJ has been at the centre of a number of these, and Stuart raised issues there particularly around technology. Sorry, particularly around technology, which is crucial. So,
right, so we've been dealing with leaks in journalism, I guess, since the beginning of the times. Back in one of the biggest leaks in recent history, the Pentagon Papers, when the source wanted to give the Pentagon Papers, which was this report that was around 7,000 pages, wanted to give that report to the New York Times or the Washington Post, he actually had to go and photocopy this report and then physically give it to the reporters. If we fast forward to another story of like that we may all remember, right? The Watergate scandal, and who hasn't seen All the President's Men, where we see the reporters meeting in parking lots with Deep Throat, so that, you know, Deep Throat's identity didn't get exposed. So if we look at history, we've had to depend on some sort of, you know, physical exchange, like in the Pentagon Papers, or we've had to meet physical exchange of things like documents, or physical exchange of information, meeting with sources. Today, you can be in your house with your family being sick, and trying to deal with a mess that it's having children and your wife, and you're trying to take care of that, and receive a simple message saying, "Hello, I'm John Doe. Are you interested in data?" And in the middle of that family chaos, you can reply and say, "Of course," and get the largest leak in journalism history to date at that point. So that's really a game changer in the way we deal with how information can get to us. That's the story of how it happened with the Panama Papers. So that message was received by Bastian Obermeyer in that very situation when Bastian was dealing with his sick family, and he replied yes when other media organizations that received that message didn't, when WikiLeaks didn't. So it's not like the source, who's anonymous and remains anonymous, John Doe, said, oh, I'm going to go to this German because of, no, I mean, he was just lucky to reply yes while the others didn't, no? Today, giving information or publishing information, raw information and original documents from a private company does no longer need a journalist in the middle. Who doesn't, we've had a lot of like recent scandals like the DNC emails, the Sony hack. Those were dumped either in the internet or, sent to WikiLeaks. So actually, not only the way we can receive documents has changed, but also the way that information can be dumped in a massive scale no longer requires a journalist, right? So that is something that gets us thinking a lot in ICIJ and how we do things and how we need to invest in, first, secure channels to receive information, and second, in technology to make these massive amounts of information accessible. For the Panama Papers, the reporters at Süddeutsche Zeitung said that one of the reasons that they gave us the documents is because it was the most selfish thing to do. Bastian and Friedrich said that, they were looking through the piles and they were like, yeah, I can have 4 or 5 front pages in Süddeutsche Zeitung, but actually, in here we have connections with more than 200 countries. I'm not the expert in what happens in Spain, in the UK, or in South Africa. I want others to do the work there, so I really know if there's a prime minister of Iceland or the president of Argentina. So it's actually, that was one of the main reasons why they actually shared that stuff, because they wanted their best story. And in order to get the best story today with such massive amounts of information and complex data that we cannot get access to because of the world we live in, collaboration, in my opinion, is the only way. Because no one newsroom has so many people to invest or to put into a project. For the Panama Papers, we gathered a team of almost 400 reporters in more than 80 countries, around more than 100 media organizations. We don't have numbers. I don't have numbers to tell you. And that equals X amount of dollars. What I can tell you is we put all of the ICIJ staff for a year. That was $2 million. And that's just one of the 100 media organizations. Of course, not every media organization invested $2 million. But I'm pretty sure that if we were to do the numbers, and I encourage the Reuters Institute to do numbers on this, we would be able to come up with a very huge figure. No one media organization can invest that much. The way we do this, so it's economically available, or like, yes, the economic availability, or the reason why this is economically how do you say, a good expenditure is because when The Guardian joins, they bring their 5 journalists, and The Guardian pays for their 5 journalists. When Le Monde comes, they bring whatever journalists, they pay for their journalists. We don't have money in media, but we have one currency, which is the reporters we've already invested in. So that's how we were able to pay for this very big multi-million-dollar cost operation for the Panama Papers, because each one of us paid for their own stuff. In addition, at the ICIJ, we are like this neutral player, similar to the Switzerland of the investigation, where we're neutral, we're there to, like, as a referee, if there are any discrepancies, we have the final say on when to publish. We establish a few ground rules that the media organizations need to obey to, although they're very simple. They are, we'll publish at the same time. ICIJ decides on the date, although it's in consultation with the rest, and you need to credit the original source of the documents, and we want you to share. And we want you to share is one of the main points in the agreement, because big media organizations have not worked with us in the past because they didn't want to share. I think that I'm happy that the Panama Papers basically opened up the eyes to some media organizations that didn't want to collaborate in the past because they didn't see the value in sharing with colleagues around the world. And now think there's a value in collaborating in this difficult media landscape and this difficult and complex world we live in. From the ICIJ, not only we are this neutral player that helps being the referee or setting up the ground rules, we also are the project managers of the team. I think project management is completely underestimated. If you have a big collaboration, you need somebody seeing what's happening, curating the content, really like guiding people. It's like the coach of the team saying, hey, why don't you pass the ball? Or hey, talk to this person. Or hey, why don't you share it with the others? And it's also key in our work, the technology and how the platforms that we've built mostly based on open source software, have fostered collaboration. And I'm happy to talk more about that later.
Mark, thanks very much. Can I just pick you up very briefly on that endpoint? So in terms of the technology, for something on the scale of the Panama Papers, you had communication technology, ability to share information, you had database analysis. What other kinds of technology did you need?
Right, so the needs when you collaborate are mostly the same needs. Need number one, you want people to talk to each other and communicate. You can do this in many different ways. Like I was talking to Scott Klein from ProPublica the other day, who was telling me that for a project they're doing on hate crimes and hate issues in the States, they have this weekly call that lasts 30 minutes where everybody of the media organizations just say their main findings for 3 minutes, and after 30 minutes, bang, it's done. And I do that every week. Other people I've talked to that do collaborations do like stand-up meetings similar to what you do in technology and software development, where it's like 15 minutes, everybody says what they're working on, and that's it. For us, depending on a platform, it's key. So we actually had a social networking platform where people talk to each other. We had 400 people, like meetings with 400 people would be very difficult to run. We also, the second need normally is you want people to access the documents. So we have a document sharing platform where everybody in the investigation gets access to everything. And the third need is normally to visualize. We deal with very complex topics. So we had a platform that allowed us to show visually the connections between people, companies, addresses, intermediaries, and explore this offshore economy in a visual way. So people didn't miss the dots.
Great, thanks very much. Okay, Anna, can I turn to you? I mean, OCCRP, you're at the front line of high-risk investigation, really, dealing with crime and corruption. Does that, the level of risk, does that change the approach in any way, or how you collaborate?
The OCCRP, Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, it's about international collaboration, actually, because it's network, it's about 15 countries. It's post-Soviet countries and Europe and Balkanian countries, and almost every investigation we published, it's cross-border investigation. At least 2 countries we have this, maybe 3, maybe more. Our last big project we published, it was Laundromat project. It's about how $20 billion were transferred from Russia to Moldovan banks, and it was used by some United Kingdom offshore companies, and a lot of Ukrainian citizens were involved to this scam. And in the final, this money appeared in Latvian banks mostly. So it was a second part, and we worked on it for, I think, 6 months this time. We published it on March, and it was, I think, 20, maybe more countries were involved in this process. So we have very good experience when we worked on Panama Papers, and now working with platforms, it's like easier, because we know how to do it, and we can do projects like Laundromat, where a lot of countries involved. But for me, the best experience of international collaboration, it was for exactly Panama Papers, because it was like I think it's more than 400 journalists, yeah, were involved around the world. And I couldn't believe that everybody will be quiet. I think that the first rule of this collaboration is be quiet. It's very hard for journalists because when you have something, for example, in Ukraine we have a story about creating offshore companies by our president. He created it when he already was a president, and it was very hard to be quiet about it for a long time. So, from my experience, it's the most important things. Next one is trust each other. Because when we work with somebody, when we work with a lot of people around the world, you should trust them. If you ask them about digging something in their countries, it's like you should trust journalists because if you will doubt, it will be not good work. And one of the most important things we use in OCCRP is encrypt everything. Because OCCRP network works in countries like Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and we know that in every country we cooperate, we have different kind of security service work. And if anybody from people who work on some investigation will be under surveillance from some security service, it will be a big problem for all work, for all network, 3 people or 400 people. So we have a lot of trainings in OCCRP for us and for people, for another people about encrypted, about kind of encrypting, and it's very important because we work with information and we should be quiet for a long time, for months and months. And if somebody will be under surveillance, it will be a big problem for all projects.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned trust there. How do you just know when you can trust a new partner?
It's about, I think, for example, I know ICIJ. I think, for example, this network, you should know with who you work. ICIJ invited OCCRP to this project, to Panama Papers project. In OCCRP, we know each other. I mean, when I work with somebody or if I need somebody in some country, I ask Drew, he is head of OCCRP, who I can ask about something. And I'm sure that he knows everybody around the world, people like we. I think it's about about network.
So it's, well, I want to come back and talk about networks later, but it's about building up over a period of time and who you know, recommendation. Okay, Anna, thanks very much. Nicholas, you had a lot of success with collaborations and investigations, but you also recently wrote about what goes wrong. And I wondered if maybe you could cover both sides of that, because we've been talking very positively, but it doesn't always work, does it?
Why am I always the one to talk about what goes wrong?
Because you're the one who talks about it.
So yeah, I thought it's going to be boring if we only talk about success stories, and I think we learn more if we talk about failures. So I wanted to talk about when collaborative projects fail, and I'm lucky because I have a lot of experience in that. And I also made projects that were successful, and that's why I get invited to conferences, but then I crash everything. Anyway, so I run a company called Journalism++ for the past 5 years. We're a group of data journalists based in Paris and Berlin, and we coordinated maybe in total 5-6 investigations, collaborative investigations. One was called the Migrant Files, was very successful. We measured how many people, men and women, died in their attempt to come to Europe. We did that with 30 journalists. We did that from 2013 to 2002 last year. And yeah, that's exactly what you've been describing. It's great, everybody works together, and from week to week you see how the work grows exponentially until launch date, and then you have the bang and everyone is talking about the project. What happens now when things do not go according to plan? Something that everyone here on the panel has said is that it's extremely expensive to run a collaborative investigation. You have to do the project management. You said it costs $2 million US just to coordinate the Panama Papers.
And the technology.
And the technology, but that's part of the coordination, I'd say. But anyway, I mean, it's a lot of money. And even if you do that at a smaller scale, the other investigations we did involve maybe 4 or 5 journalists and as many media partners. And even at this small scale, it costs a lot to do the project management. And my point is, when something goes wrong, and in the case of our projects, once, for instance, we had a whole project. We were investigating the influence of the Turkish government among Turkish mosques in Europe. And we really needed to access data that we wanted to get under the Freedom of Information Act in Turkey, which at the time when we created the project was totally feasible. Except that between the moment the project started and the moment we asked for the data to the Turkish government had changed the way it dealt with journalists. Many of our contacts were then in jail, so we couldn't access the data. We tried for 6 months, and at the end we had to give up. So basically the plan needed to change, and that's where things get complicated, because you have a number of journalists that you need to convince that the project is going to change somehow, and it's exponentially harder when you have to do that in a collaboration as opposed as when you do that with your own team. So yeah, when things go wrong, they go wrong in a very big way. And to go back to the first question that Richard mentioned, why do we have so many collaborations now? One aspect is, as Mar said, that you have bigger leagues and you need to collaborate if you want to treat these. But there is another aspect, which is it's trendy. There is a huge ideological drive towards working in network structure. And the problem, in my opinion, is that many of the donors, I'm talking about Google DNI, I'm talking about the European Journalism Fund, I'm talking about the European Commission, for instance, they all require that you work collaboratively. And I think as a small structure or freelancers, you should be extremely wary of these projects that demand that there is a collaborative effort, even if it's not always the best way to do a specific investigation.
Just to elaborate, why should you be wary of donors who say we want collaboration? What's the risk?
Because as a freelance journalist, you need money. And if the people who give you money require that you collaborate, then you have an incentive to create a collaboration, even if you could have done the story yourself.
Okay. Yeah.
And then you might run into trouble. I mean, if we've done the Turkish story, for instance, just ourselves, it would have been much easier to change the focus and to do a great story instead of a great failure.
Just to pick up 2 or 3 points from there, and then we'll open it up. I mean, maybe coming back to you, Stuart. To what extent do you think that at the heart of a lot of these collaborations, picking up on what Nicholas has just said, is some form of public or donor funding? I mean, so ICIJ, of course, gets donor funding to a degree. The Bureau for Investigative Journalism in the UK, ProPublica, and so on as well. It seems to me that a lot of this kind of collaboration is, although it reaches out into commercial media, is driven by donor or foundation funding or public funding in some way. Do you think that's a key factor?
I mean, there's an obvious factor there is that those organisations that tend to get donor funding need an outlet, and you need a partner to start with. So ProPublica has always been based on partnering on their stories, and taking that international is just a sort of logical extension of that. I think as Mar said, having that sort of independent referee character, organisation in the middle of really complicated stories like that, where there are sort of 400 journalists and therefore 800 different versions of what the story should be, that's really important, and them having a sort of slightly different structure sort of helps that authority, I think.
Would either at BuzzFeed or The Guardian, might you have got a story yourself and then thought, actually, what we really, well, I suppose you did, but what we really have to do is to share this?
Yeah, I mean,
and the decision for that is just about resource and scope, is it? Or?
Well, with Snowden, it was about the legal threat. We had the Snowden documents in the US, but that didn't make any difference to the UK government. They were still threatening to sort of, shut the Guardian down if we didn't hand them over. And, it might have been that Guardian US could have relied on the First Amendment to protect us from that, but we didn't really want to test that. So going to the Times and ProPublica just to make sure the story got out and that we weren't shut down was a sort of important move.
And just picking up for anybody to come in on, do you think therefore there is an inherent strength in working as part of a network, which again is referred to, because if you come out with something in 10 countries with 10 organisations simultaneously, it's much harder for one government or one organisation to really try and slap you down. They think, well, where do you start?
There's no doubt about that, and it's almost like it's almost when you first make when after months of working and you start to make those approaches to the targets of stories. When you're saying at the start of your right of reply, we are working with journalists in multiple countries. In the UK, it's really important because at a stroke that almost removes the threat of being injuncted and losing the documents. Because what's the point? And I think just if you want to get the story out, it's a really powerful tool.
Does anybody else feel about the strength of working as a network?
Yeah, just to add to what Stuart was saying, that actually happened in the HSBC in the Swiss Leaks files with the Guardian. So when the Guardian approached HSBC 6 weeks before for reply, when they approached them for comment, 6 weeks before, in many it's a lot of time, but I understand the legal climate there is a bit
they were fun
different.
Conversations.
But the first reaction of HSBC was, okay, we're going to prevent you from publishing in the UK, and then the rest of the team started sending requests for comment to HSBC and the Guardian lawyers, and you know this story better probably, but the Guardian lawyers were like, well, I think you're getting requests from comment from everybody else in the world. You can prevent publication in the UK, but it's going to be published in France, in Spain, it's going to be published in Chile, it's going to be published. So do you really want to do that?
Yeah.
And what ended up happening is HSBC ended up sending us a 4-page detailed response to all our requests for comments.
Yeah, when we were doing HSBC, the first approach to the bank was being handled by their global general counsel, and they were seeing it as a sort of legal response, and it was really heavy duty and sort of quite threatening. And as they started to understand that they weren't just taking on the Guardian, they were taking, there was an enormous wall of people sort of standing alongside. The significant moment was when it stopped being the general counsel dealing with it and started being their head of PR. And at that point, we thought, okay, it's not going to be an injunction anymore. And and they came in to the Guardian, and we had a meeting, which was, I mean, I wouldn't call it friendly, but it was certainly not, there was a very different tone from the initial conversations.
And just to add to something else, it also, I think working in a network or in a team helps, because not only you're getting this shield from some legal actions, you're also getting a shield if you work in places with very bad respect for freedom of expression. I mean, I think it's been very helpful for people working in countries where freedom of expression is not respected, and Ecuador, Venezuela, Turkey, even Russia. We've helped countries like that to get some stories sometimes out in the open. Maybe it's not them who publish a story, but then it becomes nuanced and they can report on them. And I think that it's also prevented more specific attacks or more specific threats to those journalists in countries like that, because they know they are part of a big thing. So let me give you an example, not from just one of those countries, like in Finland. So in Finland, you would think it's a very advanced country. For some weird reason, the authorities there really wanted access to the data, which is not weird. The weird act is they really wanted to raid the public television that had worked with us, and raid the houses of the reporters if that was necessary. So of course, like the reporters, the Finnish reporters came to the team and said, come on guys, this is happening. Do you have any tips? And then people started sharing tips. But in the end, we decided, okay, why don't we go public with it? And we all publish in our own newspapers. And this was next to, I don't know if it was like Freedom of the Press Day or something like that, which made it even much more fun. And once it was public, these threats to the Finnish reporters was public in newspapers and media organizations around Europe. Guess what? You know, the Finnish government was like, no, us? No, we're not gonna raid the houses of reporters. How are we gonna do that? So sometimes it helps with cases like that of like putting pressure. It's like you're not alone.
Yeah, and even OCCRP must have experience of that strengthening the network.
But actually, as I see, usually a local partner or partner about what we are talking decides how to behave with administration, with officials. I mean, for example, Panama Papers story, when everybody in the world wanted to ask our president about his offshore companies. Every media wanted to do it, and we decided that we will send in 1 month before publication, we will send this request, and it will be from the Deutsche Zeitung, Guardian, our local organizations leads to Info TV program, and BBC, I suppose. So before it, we had discussion how it will be do better. We knew that if we will send it from local TV, from our TV program, it will now answer. We knew it. But if we will ask, for example, for interview only for BBC or only for Guardian, it will be like unfair because everybody wants to be there, and we are like local partners. We are like Ukrainians, want to ask president personally about the things. So we decided that will be okay for everybody if we will send it, and we will have this after that our local organization had a very long emailing with president's lawyers, and everything we get we send to our colleagues. So from this example, usually we work this way. If we know that the main story is in Russia, for example, like with Landromat, so Russians decide how to be, when send this request, because we know how it was with Panama Papers. They sent this request for months before, and this and this press secretary of Putin start to publish some things that some propaganda will work again, something like this. So I think it's the main voice is of local partner.
Yeah, okay, that's interesting. So just before I open it up, does anyone else other than Nicholas want to confess to failures and what may have contributed to things not working?
I mean, we've had a couple of sort of collaborations that we wanted to do, and they didn't get off the ground because we couldn't get partners on side, or we couldn't just get in enough alignment to sort of take the story forward. And and those are always the ones that you really sort of regret, because you kind of think what might have been. But in terms of the wheels coming off while you're already in the middle of one, thank God, no.
So, I don't know, I need to think about this. Maybe I'm in a positive spirit. Not everything goes well. And I think that I love Stuart's comparison to romance and love relationships. Because it's very visual. We normally tend to compare the collaborations to bringing people to a dinner party, right? And sometimes you bring people to the dinner party that get drunk and mess up the dinner party. And and that's why picking who you bring to your dinner party is very key. And I think that there have been some experiences in the past in ICIJ where we've collaborated with partners or with people, or journalists that are freelancers that didn't want to obey to collaborating. I mean, I guess it's like the main rule number one for a collaboration is you need to collaborate, right? Or wanted to seize a lot of power and just like bully the investigation or bully ICIJ, or so there are it's like you bring together a group of people again for a dinner party, and somebody can get a bit drunk. So I think that choosing who you bring in the investigation is really key. And also, I think that for us, it's not about media organizations. I think that when you bring many, and this is my personal opinion, I hope nobody feels offended, but like the higher up you go in the hierarchy, the more bosses you bring into the decision, the more egos then you have to fight, right? And that works very well. You know, of course, bosses get things done. That's why they are there. But we found it's a great strategy to have like journalists who are actually are advocates inside the newsroom, because they actually have the ear of their editors. So for us, it's not, when we decide on who to collaborate, it's not, we don't call like the editor-in-chief of the newspaper. We call the ICIJ member or the reporter that we've been collaborating in that newsroom and say, hey, do you like this? Okay, now you go and convince your people using whatever tools you have at your disposal to convince your editors. And I think that's a much better way of like infiltrating the newsroom and getting things done. If you have like these allies inside the newsroom who are the journalists that know how to convince their bosses. I've seen in the past issues with egos, and even though investigative journalists we have big egos, bosses have more.
Yeah. Egos is unknown in journalism. Okay, right. We've got 10 or 15 minutes for questions. Who'd like to kick off? Yeah, front row. I think if you could just hang on for the microphone, because I think it's being recorded. So.
Hello. I have two questions. Is this?
Yeah. Okay. Yep. Yep.
One is for Anna, right? That's your name. About so you already talked about how the OCCRP protects or like helps people in like more difficult situation to release material. But what about when you talk about Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan and like how do you deal with that there? Like how can you collaborate with journalists there? Like what are the methods that you use concretely to you know, make a collaboration possible. And my second question is for you about BuzzFeed. I know that you also have an investigative team of some sorts. I was wondering what the structure of that is and how like BuzzFeed as a global institution works in this investigative.
Okay, should we come to Anna first and then Stuart can pick that up?
Yeah, actually, it's a very big challenge for CCRP to work with these countries. We name this project Korruptistan because it's about Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, everything stan. So Azerbaijan to not stan, but anyway. So it's very hard to work there. I think that everybody knows about Khadija Ismailova, who was in prison. She is OCCRP reporter. In Azerbaijan, she was in prison a couple years, and it's pretty hard because in these countries, journalists doesn't have so big protection, so big support from civil society. Like for example, in Ukraine and even in Russia, I think so. And it's very hard, but usually people from Sarajevo, it's Bosnia, where OCCRP is based. Work as editors with people from Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and the reporters never write their name in articles. So part of them work in exile, I mean somewhere in Europe, part of them work in, sometimes they have some network in their countries, and it's sometimes editors meet with these reporters not in their countries, but when they go for trainings, usually it's very hard because they know that they're under surveillance, these trainers, these editors. But anyway, we are trying to do it. I think it's very complicated because almost no social society support.
Stuart, the BuzzFeed investigative team.
Yeah, so investigations are absolutely at the core of the BuzzFeed news operation. In the UK, we have an investigations team of 4, about to be 5 people who are dedicated investigations correspondents, edited by Heidi Blake, who came from the Sunday Times and broke the FIFA Papers story. And they are globally, they're part of a much bigger team. There's a big investigations team based in New York, run by Mark Schiffs, who previously was at the Wall Street Journal. And they, I think it's a big luxury for an organization like BuzzFeed to have such a massive team of dedicated and world-class full-time investigations correspondents, because a lot of newsrooms are sort of scaling that sort of operation back. And for us, you know, we've got that sort of global flexibility and muscle, so it's tempting to think that you don't actually need to share, because we can do it all ourselves, and we've got big data teams, and we've got huge technological know-how. But we found huge success when we have shared stuff, and we did the tennis racket story with the BBC, which, you know, we were all in London doing the story, but it was a story that, you know, worked across borders, and we worked with a couple of Italian journalists on that, journalists in Australia, and that was absolutely massive for us, and it went far bigger than I think if BuzzFeed had just tried to do it solo.
Okay, more questions? Nobody? You've been talked out?
Can I say something?
You can, well, yeah.
While you guys think of questions, thinking of the value of collaborating, and I think that some of the criticism around collaborations or around Panama Papers have been connected to, oh, you didn't publish all the data, and oh, you're keeping some stories secret. We didn't publish the whole data because we thought, you know, there were documents that needed to remain private. There were passports, there were bank accounts. It was very difficult to shift through 11.5 million files and just dumping them or shifting automatically over them to distinguish what was private or not. And other organizations like WikiLeaks have a different point of view. And some of those criticisms have come from WikiLeaks. The reality is that I feel working in collaboration is also raising the standard of the output that we produce, because it's like working on a scientific paper that gets peer reviewed. Anything that is found is shared, and then it gets peer reviewed. So, for example, we had a few hairy situations where the owners of newspapers were in the data. You know, that was a big discussion. It's like, do we want to publish it? Yeah, but like, you know, I'm getting a lot of internal pressure, and you know, some of the people in the team said, okay, we understand you're getting internal pressure. I cannot imagine how hard it is. But if you don't publish it, I'm going to publish it in my country. It's like, you know, once something has been found, it's very difficult to convince 100 media organizations to say, no, let's not publish it, you know. So actually that works great, because not only it helps, you know, for everything that is found to be published if it's noteworthy and interest for, you know, for the public, but also helps the journalists inside media organizations deal with difficult situations like my publisher is in the data or the owner of the paper is in the data. And one thing that I'm very happy about for the Panama Papers is that whenever there was a media owner in the data, we published it, and we forced or helped people inside media organizations to publish that information.
Sorry, can I just pick up on that? I think when you're sort of doing these big investigations, it's almost like a matter of, you know, it's par for the course now that you're going to get criticised for not publishing all the data, and this is something that we took over when we did the embassy cables with WikiLeaks, and it was a big thing when we were doing Snowden, obviously, that, you know, where we sort of published, you know, a tiny fraction of the material that we had access to, and that's something that you have to be sort of very clear at the start what the story is you're trying to tell and what the public interest case is for revealing that information and the material behind it. And throughout your investigation, that has to be the sort of, you know, guiding principle. Otherwise, you will spend the whole time arguing about whether X document or Y file should go live.
Yeah, good. Okay. Nicholas, you've been very quiet. Any final thoughts? No? More questions? Okay, let's go through these two. All right, at the back first, then we'll come to the front. Yeah.
Hey, I'm Marianne from Haida. I wanted to ask each of you, what advice would you give to someone who works in an organization that is not a member of ICIJ or doesn't have any experience doing any cross-border or even national collaborations into how to make it happen? Let's say that they do come up with a story that they think could have a broader impact either in their country or abroad. What is the number one advice you would give them to make it happen?
Who wants to pick that up? What's the...
Share it with BuzzFeed. I think you know, I think ICIJ would be a sort of great starting point if you've got material that you think is a sort of international story and you want people to sort of help you work a way through of getting that out there. don't want to be an ad for you, but that's, that would be a very good place to start, obviously.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, don't wait to be invited.
Yeah, exactly. That's, the expertise is out there, and, journalists are, ready and willing to take your call.
I would just want to say, I mean, sometimes people come to us, and in this very room, I could ask a question of like, oh yes, but I'm from this country, and you've worked with another media organization, but I also want to collaborate. And of course, please, we're open to working with media organizations all around the world and to change partners. It's not like we are married to anybody.
Okay. It's Stuart's open relationship. Okay?
Yeah, it's an open relationship. But at the same time, I think that it's key. I've done collaborations that are not through ICIJ. It's key to open up, to really be open to people from other countries and have your own network of people. If possible, people that are inside media organizations or freelancers that have the power to publish, because at some point you're going to have to pay for this, right? So you can pay for it if a reporter is inside the media organization, by the media organization investing his time on the investigation, or you have to apply for a grant, right? So I think that it's important to try to have as wide a network as you can have, to that. Then if all of a sudden you're like investigating and you get a court case in Spain and you're like, oh my God, but there are these connections to Romania and to France, and then you don't have to like Google journalists in France, I know I can call, and then I think, again, I think the key of why things worked at ICIJ is those personal relationships with the journalists, because then you have 3 or 2, 3 or 400 allies. It's not just you fighting. And I think personal relationships is the basis to establish trust and then to collaborate.
Okay, it's a great ad. Right.
Yeah, hi, thank you for the panel discussion. My name is Andriy Sislenko, I'm from Ukraine, as Anna here. A couple of questions arised in the end. The very first one, how about the ethics of journalism? So you have all these partners that you have in different countries, and you mentioned that personal relationships are super important. Probably. Exactly important. But when the ethics of journalism differs from country to country, how do you deal with that? That's number one. Anna, you mentioned encryption, and I don't know, probably could you just explain like super basics? How do we learn that? How do we, just regular journalists who are not investigative journalists, how do we learn that? And number three, you work with tons of data. Do you use machine learning or any tools for data digging, not like 400 journalists around the world, but the actual computers who dig it for you? Thank you.
Okay, so 3 quick questions. Let's try and pick them up and then get another question in before we have to wrap. So who wants to pick up ethics, different ethics across different countries? Is that an issue for anybody?
One thing, every newspaper or every media organization that works with us is responsible for whatever they publish and the way they do things. The only main rules of ICIJ is, again, we have to all publish together, and we set a rule on what can be published, and also the approach for comment is also coordinated. But then again, if you're in a country where you only call people 1 day in advance and it doesn't affect the global story, we're fine with that. Okay. So everybody responsible for their own shit.
I think it's just that point about if you know what the public interest is in advance and you know what the ground rules are, then people are free to operate within their own journalistic ethics. It's where you have a sort of clash on what the public interest in the story is that really becomes a
okay,
problem.
we've got about 2 minutes left. So encryption, I mean, there's a lot of guides out there on the web. Anna, do you want to pick it up?
It's very easy, actually. We use Signal. It's messenger, like Viber or something, but it's very good level of encryption. And we use PGP. It's more complicated, but it's possible for people with brain. So usually a lot of Vita crypt and a lot of things. If you need, I will write you.
It's even easier. Security in a box. That has all those links, and then you can also go to Electronic Frontier Foundation. They have something that is something self-defense, security self-defense, or something like that.
Okay,
and you have all those listed.
And then finally, automation, machine learning. How much is that coming into dealing with particularly big data sets and so on?
There was a whole other panel about how the technology and data infrastructures. Right, so we discussed for an hour about that. Machine learning, it's a bit far away from what we're doing, but we're heading in that direction. But we need to get simpler things done first, like processing documents before machines can predict the future. But in any case, we're going to need humans too.
Okay,
I think.
We've probably got room for one very quick last question if anyone's got one. We've got 2 minutes left. No? All right, otherwise we'll call it an end there. Thank you very much, and thanks to all of the panel. Thank you.
Targets of the sorts of stories that we go after tend to be transnational. So there's big corporations, big political movements, big money, which doesn't respect borders, and therefore neither should we. And then there's the sort of, there's resource reasons as well for these investigations. A lot of newsrooms are shrinking, and to handle some of these stories takes quite a lot of resources and expertise, and some newsrooms just aren't set up to have the sort of data firepower that MAR brings from ICIJ, for example, to be able to build searchable databases at that sort of scale. Doesn't exist in a lot of newsrooms, so you need that international expertise. And I think there's the big thing about if you have a story that goes live across multiple countries and jurisdictions, you have a huge audience and therefore a huge impact, and that's what drives real change and accountability, because it's a lot harder for ICIJ or for offshore companies to just duck away from an individual story if everywhere they look that story is running in multiple outlets. So I think the sort of reasons for these investigations is really clear. What really matters is how you do them. We've been thinking about what sort of I've done a lot of these sorts of things, and I've been thinking about the different kinds of collaboration there are, and it struck us that they are like having real relationships, and they fall into the sort of similar categories of having real relationships.
Anna Babinet's from the Organised Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, OCCRP, a lot of experience in doing these kinds of investigations. Mark Abra here on my left from the ICIJ, of course, did a lot of work on the Panama Papers. We have Nicholas Kayser-Bril there from J++. There's also a lot of experience in these kind of collaborations and investigative journalism. And at the end, Stuart Miller from the UK editor of BuzzFeed and formerly head of news at The Guardian. So I'm going to ask each of the panel just to say a few opening comments on their views about why we're seeing more collaborations, what makes them work, what doesn't, what are some of the key factors behind it. Then we'll get into a discussion and open it up for questions. And as I said, we're going to run for about 55 minutes, so we'll be out on time. So, Stuart, could you kick us off?
Thanks, Richard. So it won't surprise you to learn that, on this panel, people really believe in these international collaborations, and I'm not going to rock the boat there. I think there's a growing need for cooperation in journalism across borders. The reasons are obvious. There's legal threats. In the UK, the legal climate is becoming slightly more fraught. In the US, who knows what's going to happen there, and across other jurisdictions as well. So having sharing across borders for journalists helps protect us from that. Also, the ships. There's the one night stand where you will collaborate on one story. It's it's quick, it's straightforward. Everybody leaves happy, and we're all friends afterwards. There's the holiday romance, which is something that might go on for a couple of weeks and leaves you with a rosy glow and a bit of nostalgia. But again, it's all quite straightforward. There's the kind of the big scale ones that Mara will be involved in. I like to think about as a sort of deep and open relationship with a revolving cast of partners. which are incredibly successful. And then there's, you know, the ones that I've been involved in with the New York Times or ProPublica, especially where you're countering legal threats, where it's a sort of marriage of convenience. It's a bit like Green Card with Gerard Depardieu, if you're old enough to remember that. But, you know, where you come together because you've got material and there's legal threats, and it works, and then that sort of grows into a sort of lasting relationship, as we did with The Guardian and the New York Times on WikiLeaks and Snowden. So there's lots of different kinds, and you have to know what sort of kinds you're getting into before you start. A couple of other thoughts. I think it's really important when you're doing these things to establish the ground rules up front, because it's never the thing that you think is going to screw it up that can screw it up. So very rarely is the argument about the story or where the story should go, but often it's about what.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for giving up the Saturday afternoon sunshine to come and listen to us for won't quite be an hour. We want to be out on time, so 55 minutes or so. I'm Richard Sambrook. I'm a professor of journalism at Cardiff University in the UK, and I also work with the Reuters Institute at Oxford University. This panel is about collaboration, handling big data and investigative journalism. Springs from a workshop that we had at Oxford just before Christmas discussing these issues. Why are we seeing more collaborations between news organisations on investigative journalism? Why are we seeing more big pan-national, international collaborations and investigative stories, particularly relating to big data? What are the factors that make those big collaborations work? What are the criteria and the things you need in place in order to make those very big and complicated editorial operations work? And what are some of the problems and some of the reasons that sometimes they fail? And trying to understand a little bit what lies behind what seems to be something that has a new energy behind it in terms of collaboration around big investigations. So we have a fantastic panel here. On my right, we have